Narcissistic people actually feel tremendous shame over their failure to launch. It's at odds with the grandiose defenses, and they know that other people may not view them as successes because they haven't launched. What is it with narcissistic people and abandonment? So let's take it on. What is it? So, the very people, these narcissistic folks who are literally like bulls in a china shop when it comes to their relationships, may actually be far more fragile around abandonment. So let's take apart what is that about. Foremost, it's about attachment. Narcissism is a personality style which is very multi-determined, and we've taken that on in many other videos. There's no singular path to narcissism, and the different backstories can result in narcissistic people that look different kinds of ways. Now, sometimes what we do know is that the more chaotic, neglectful childhood backstories that result in narcissism tend to land more and look like vulnerable narcissism. The overly indulgent, emotionally available, no limits, entitled parents and childhoods, those will slightly more often beget the more grandiose ones. But no matter what the path, attachment issues appear to belie the evolution of narcissism and then the subsequent abandonment issues. Most narcissistic folks are anxiously attached, though there is also some overlap with avoidant attachment. Anxious attachments are associated with this idea that a person doesn't do well with separation. They're anxious when they're apart from a primary person in their life and can get angry at the time of reunion, sort of feeling angry that they were ever left in the first place. For folks with anxious attachments, separations and the endings of relationships are experienced as really deep wounds that are harder for them to get past. The other element that makes abandonment such an issue in narcissistic personalities is their need for control. This means that a narcissistic person is willing to end a relationship on their own terms, but they don't like being left. The control is once again a sort of grandiose defense that allows the vulnerable parts of them to sort of be buffered or protected. So the control means that they control the narrative and nobody really gets to leave. So if someone does leave, there is a cascade of "how dare you" sort of rage. Then there are optics. Narcissistic people care what things look like. They may do shady things in private, but don't like it when things don't look what they think is right in public. Because if they don't look great in public, that affects them getting validation. So as a result, people who are narcissistic will do things like continue to mistreat a spouse and stay in the marriage for show, cheat in private, and then be enraged if someone leaves them because now things don't look so good if they don't have sort of the marriage, the Christmas card, the picture, all of that. And all of this comes together under the big bow of lack of self-awareness and fear of vulnerability. To speak about fears, to do the work of addressing their own shame, to be more clear on how childhood attachment issues and other past family stuff may have impacted them, that self-awareness can then be what brings a person into their adult self and not be pulled around by the nose of insecurity, fragility, and fear. It's damn near impossible for narcissistic folks to plug into their vulnerability because it feels cataclysmic to them, and they will rage and lash out at anyone who pings or evokes that vulnerability and that shame in them. This is why narcissism as a personality style is so complex in adult relationships. There is the little child in the narcissist that desperately needs attention. There's the wannabe superhero that has to be the boss and in control all the time to keep the insecurity under control. There is that internal publicist that needs everything to look right. And there is an utter lack of self-examination or clarity. People are often surprised at the depth of a narcissistic person's response to someone ending a relationship with them. And it's not just romantic relationships. It can be leaving a job or ending a business partnership. It can be distancing or ending a friendship or ending a relationship with a family member. In many ways, the silent agreement we unfortunately craft with narcissistic people is that we're supposed to unquestioningly put up with their invalidation and never leave. Issues like post-separation abuse, the escalated harassment we see when somebody breaks up from a narcissistic person, the stalking, that they can't let go behavior after a breakup, all of that's a manifestation of these abandonment issues that completely go sort of full tilt. So too are passive-aggressive social media campaigns against someone, smear campaigns after the relationship ends, and petty behavior that can persist for years. Folks who decide to cut off narcissistic relationships have the sense it will be hard, but most people are surprised at how hard it is. And when you account for what maybe your own struggles with anxious attachment are and throw that into the mix, it's a wonder that anyone ever gets out of these relationships. But odds are their abandonment issues are worse than yours, so don't let that tough person exterior throw you off. And that is why these breakups are never easy, no matter what kind of relationship it is. The narcissistic person's grandiosity is a really interesting barrier to them actually getting anything done. Narcissistic folks love to talk a big game. They like to talk about the screenplays they're writing that are going to get made, and they know a guy who knows a guy who has a connection for this new business that they're going to open, or they're going to start a new makeup line or handbag line or cupcake store or craft business or pie shop or consulting practice, so many things, and they talk about it. Heck, they even get the logo made before there's actually anything done. These are all lovely endeavors, but to make these things get off the ground require tons of hustle, hard work, timing, more hustle, persistence, grit, and hard work. The problem is that so many narcissistic people feel entitled to success, and they often resent the world when it doesn't deliver on the successes that they believe that they deserve. The idea that they have to work hard, roll up, take lots of shots at target, sometimes endure disappointment. Again, that flies in the face of the grandiosity. I'm so great. Why do I have to try so hard? And then they fall into victimization. Well, other people don't have to try so hard. Other people are taking advantage of me. These narcissistic folks literally want businesses handed to them and want them to be profitable on day one. Many narcissistic folks will cite ADHD as the reason that they cannot get things done, despite, in most cases, that they were never formally assessed for it. I gotta tell you, when what's called ADHD consistently sits alongside patterns like lack of empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, validation seeking, I tend to be a little dubious about using it as a sort of an explanation or a way to get out of things. It becomes an excuse for everything for why they shouldn't have to get out of bed in a timely manner in the morning, or meet deadlines, or even show up to a job on time, or listen to what anyone else has to say. And then they'll say things like, oh, I just have so many amazing ideas and so many creative thoughts. I'm just distracted by all of it. I can't focus on just one. There is good research showing the impact, for example, from a treatment perspective, the utility and the impact of techniques like mindfulness on ADHD. It works well. But alas, if you were to make the suggestion of mindfulness training to a narcissist, then the therapist or anyone else that's trying to help the narcissist is often faced with contempt for suggesting something like mindfulness. You simply can't win. Now, another issue that comes up quite regularly with the narcissistic person's failure to launch is the idea that, oh, nobody is showing me how to become successful. I'm not sure exactly who's supposed to show you that, but they will often blame parents, teachers, lack of mentors, and all of that without ever actually reaching out to anyone to even try to find guidance. They actually, I guess they expect people are going to reach out to them and offer them pearls of wisdom. There is very little taking of responsibility for themselves, but lots of energy is put into blaming the world for why they couldn't reach grand heights of success. If they put as much time into working as they do into blaming, I don't see how they couldn't be successful. Now, narcissistic folks are often quite perfectionistic. It's a manifestation of the grandiose defense. By holding a perfect standard, in a way they think, well, then I'm perfect. The problem with perfectionism, and not just narcissistic perfectionism, but anyone who struggles with perfectionism, is that it stops things from getting done. And many narcissistic folks who have this perfectionistic bent won't launch because they tend to get so lost in small details and are rigidly stuck to those details, so nothing real gets done. And of course, as we all know, narcissistic people care so much about how they look to the world, about success, about being the very best, about being seen as the very best. And in many ways, let me tell you, that does them no favors. They aren't interested in the climb. They are only interested in the summit. And they have lots of contempt for the climb. They want to talk about their IPO, the big house they're going to buy, the vacations they're going to take, the things that they're going to do when they have their success, the power that they're going to have. They like to talk about that summit, that outcome, but there's almost never a well-articulated sense of how to do the gut work to get there. The daily, often unrecognized work of dues paying or just trying things out to see what works. That kind of day-to-day slog, that is not interesting to a narcissistic person. Their focus is on the grandiose conclusion, and it doesn't include all of the work that has to happen in between. If you talk with a narcissistic person, well, perhaps in a casual conversation, you will see that they're really good about talking about the big goal at the end of the road. They haven't opened the business yet, but they're already talking about franchising it. They don't have anything resembling a business plan, and they're already looking at places they're going to rent and the display cases that they're going to use. They haven't applied to school yet, but they're already talking about graduating and then getting their first job and how much money they're going to make. Listen, initially, it can be sort of fun to listen to these big dreams, but over time, it becomes a bit annoying, as though you were watching a children's show about something sort of fantastical that isn't going to happen. And if you're having to bankroll this, it can get really, really annoying. But where this can be most difficult is if this unlaunched narcissistic person is at all financially dependent on you. A narcissistic adult child, a narcissistic partner, maybe even someone you work with. They may at times be hostile, irritable. They may blame you for their lack of success. They may be full of self-loathing for having nothing to do all day. They may be rageful, entitled, saying things like, ugh, it's BS that someone as smart as me has to jump through all of these hoops. And they still with that grandiosity, and then talking about everything from their ADHD to the lack of support to nobody believes in them despite you supporting them day after day. Then they'll talk about how the world is unfair, that life is unjust. All of these become the reasons for their not succeeding. I have witnessed many people put tens of thousands of dollars and hours into trying to help a narcissistic person launch. After all that, only to have them still living in a financially dependent state and blaming you for it. Narcissistic people actually feel tremendous shame over their failure to launch. It's at odds with the grandiose defenses, and they know that other people may not view them as successes because they haven't launched. The social comparison that narcissistic people engage in, for example, looking at their social media, perhaps seeing someone else that they know who is succeeding far more than they are, it can definitely evoke that shame even more. And that shame will turn into rage that they lash out with at the people who most support them, like their family members and their partners. It can feel absolutely terrible to help and sacrifice and support and then have someone turn around and blame you for them not launching. And it's here that we tend to see a lot of enabling. Some parents feel guilty that their narcissistic child isn't launching. In fact, many parents may even be reluctant to see their child through a lens of narcissism. And parents, for example, in this situation, may keep feeding the beast in hopes that their support will leave their child feeling supported so they will finally launch. But alas, the victimhood that we so often see that becomes a part of the narcissistic person's identity, you supporting them, even though they claim they are not supported, actually doesn't work. Because then it kind of takes away an excuse for not succeeding, right? So you can't win. It's easier for them to remain victimized and passive aggressive. It's as though that's almost more congruent with their identity. The grandiose and entitled expectations of sort of quick success is what trips up many a narcissistic person, and it can contribute to the failure to launch. This mixes up with their tendency to engage in lots of social comparison, because narcissistic people will often compare themselves to exceptional, very exceptional and privileged cases. The trust fund kid, the kid whose parent is bringing them to take over their own very successful company, or somebody who has connections at a certain university and can get them in, or the kid whose parent is already a successful movie star wanting to go into the entertainment biz. Because those special people of that kind of privilege are sort of viewed as special. Those special people are in line with how the narcissistic person views themselves. Unlike the rest of us unwashed schlubs who don't come from fancy family legacies, and we just had to get up and do the work and hope that it keeps the rent paid and the lights on. A narcissistic person hates the idea of being that ordinary. To be ordinary for a narcissistic person is actually like hell. If you are experiencing this kind of frustration in a narcissistic relationship, you are not alone. Failure to launch is a universal feature of the narcissistic relationship. So what do you do? And think about it. There's so many ways that this can play out. There's really not much you can do. And that's a sort of a kind of defeatist, but there's really not. The more you keep giving into it, the more you are enabling it. And you don't need to be intentionally cruel, but you're not going to fix it by giving them more and more resources. After a while, a narcissist can become a real money pit. Ultimately, we are all responsible for how each of our own stories turn out in many ways. And some of us may have had many, many more barriers in our way than others. People figure it out. But that rationale only works with people who are not chronically grandiose. Another situation to sort of keep in mind in these relationships is, for example, if let's say you are in a relationship with somebody who's on this constant failure to launch, trying to launch this, trying to launch that, bigger idea, they get frustrated, they feel entitled, they don't really do the work, they feel almost like contemptuous that they have to, and you're actually trying to have a family or raise kids with a person like this. It can be incredibly painful to watch the kinds of financial sacrifices you and your kids often have to make for the folly of a narcissistic person's dream. And you may wonder, are they not seeing the impact this is having on the kids? No, they're not, because they can't see what's happening around them. Because keep in mind, as always, the narcissistic person isn't going to change on your watch. It can be frustrating as hell to watch this. And it can also be draining you financially if they aren't contributing to a household, and especially if you are the primary provider of money and household work. If you are spending money on them that you're going to need, for example, in older age, If you keep giving advice that is never taken and wasting your time, this is not only financially draining you, it's really psychologically draining you. We are all responsible for our own launch, for our own flight, right? A gust of wind certainly helps, but the rest of it is up to us. And I guess that narcissistic grandiosity and entitlement are like the weights, like hanging off the side of a balloon, that keep the narcissistic folks from taking off in many cases. They have an interesting obsession with order, and specifically with very ordered living arrangements. They eat in a very specific way, at very specific times, with a very specific temperature kept in the house, with very rigid daily schedules, and their same precise, exercise or yoga ritual at the same time per day, followed by the same cup of whatever magical herbal something or other they drink in their very specific cup. And because narcissists tend to intimidate and bully and oppress and force everyone into their schedules, they're often able to get away with it. Often, it's because the narcissist keeps financial control over the household or the community in which they live. So because they have that control from such a fundamental level, it's usually their way or the highway. Now, these rigid, obsessive patterns can actually be quite bizarre to witness. Now, interestingly, some narcissists, and this definitely came through in the Epstein article as an example, can be downright what we call fastidious, like clean to almost fault, and restrictive in all of their health habits. And despite being dysregulated, cruel, and terrifying people, as malignant narcissists are, they may take a very strong and antagonistic and very self-righteous stance against certain behaviors, I don't know, like alcohol or drugs or tobacco or vaping in their presence. Now, many of us don't like these things in our presence, but we find an appropriate and regulated way to set the boundary without shaming the individual engaged in that behavior. They don't. If anyone's doing something they don't like, nobody eats sugar in my house, and really shame the person doing it. There's something cruel about that. They can also be obsessed with physical order in their environments to the point where it almost looks like an obsessive compulsive picture, but it's not. Their homes may be characterized by surgical precision and order, things cleaned multiple times per day, an almost germophobic approach to wherever they spend time, their offices, their cars, their homes. And listen, Sigmund Freud would have a field day with the obsessions and order and cleanliness. He would likely frame it as a defensive correction of their internal sense of sort of dirtiness and chaos and unworthiness, because ultimately that is what the narcissist grapples with, their own sense of not enoughness that they take out on the world. But all of this orderliness is actually an interesting tell. Now, please know, I'm not talking about people who do like their lives to be tidy, who do want things in their place, rugs vacuumed, and especially these days, wanting to keep things hygienic and things put away. I'm not talking about that at all. I wish I was more like that. This is more about a rigid, unrelenting obsession with order and anger and rage that come out when those things don't happen. It's as though the obsession with order becomes just one more tool with which people like this control other people. And even in a person who may be unusually orderly, the presence of that orderliness, if it's also paired with empathy, compassion, appropriate communication, and self-reflection, that's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about the person who lashes out when their perfectly ordered world is at all interrupted. It's really when it gets bizarre and pervasive, the obsession with the home, the office, the food, the exercise rituals, the schedules, if you're going to be in my life, then this is how I run things, and don't you ever leave a dish on the counter or interrupt my meditation and yoga ritual obsessiveness. Listen, the irony is not lost on me that daily practices such as meditation and yoga, which are supposed to promote inner compassion and inner equanimity, still become a tool of abuse in the hands of a narcissist. You gotta love that. I mean, they can turn a feather into a gun. I'm not sure how, but it's their special brand of magic. But this is a tough way to live. In many ways, those who live with narcissistic individuals, not surprisingly, have to shape their lives around the narcissist rituals. It's almost like the nap schedule of an infant, right? It's quite likely that the deep ego insecurity of the narcissist means that they use this obsessive order as a means of managing their insecurity, and they're not at all aware that that's what they're doing. And all of this is actually not surprising. We, interestingly, in a very different example, can see a similar pattern in trauma survivors who sometimes will get into almost obsessive patterns of controlling their environment and trying to keep order to help them cope, to give them a sense of control. But here's the rub. Obviously, I understand that. But the struggle is that when the narcissists get caught in all this rigidity and lashing out, they'll become very angry at anyone who in any way questions their orderly, obsessive, rigid rituals, anyone who interrupts them, or anyone who lives in a way that's not consistent with the way they want to live. Now, if you work with a narcissist, this sort of obsessive order and control can make things very, very inefficient. They can get so lost in details and things being a certain way that the job often doesn't get done. They're just too caught up in the details. And it's often that they only will see things their way when they will not account for any other perspectives, even when that's bad for the bottom line. If you grew up this way, with this kind of rigid order around you, it was likely an entire childhood spent walking on eggshells. It was as though the random messiness of childhood, and listen, kids are messy, it's being a kid, that wasn't permissible. And narcissistic parents aren't very good at creating kid-centered spaces anyhow. Children often become one more accessory in the narcissistic parent's home. And the problem is that kids just don't sit nicely on a shelf until you want to show them off. That's often why narcissists can do really well with babies who are like accessories. But the minute that little kid starts walking around, making a little bit of a fuss, the narcissistic parent's out of their game. In an intimate relationship, it can be stifling. In a way, it can be, again, back to this idea of being in a relationship with an infant, because the narcissistic personality has so many needs and the timings and everything has to be just so. But here's the deal. You did actually see these patterns from the jump, from the beginning of the relationship. The meals had to be just so, or ordered just so. Their work time had to be just so. The stuff around the house had to be just so. When you see this, it's a red flag you need to pay attention to. If you move into their space, for example, or you start sharing their space, you can see that they end up being not only a bit mean about how things are kept in the house, but also miserly about sharing drawers and closet space and the like. And pay attention, I can promise you, this pattern is not going to go away. You may actually find your own life sliding into more disorder because you're burning yourself out trying to cater to the narcissist's need for order. This also links to the idea that the narcissist views other people as objects and conveniences. So if your schedule doesn't work with theirs, they will look at you quite quizzically. Because think about it. If you really were an object, like a laptop or a pile of Post-its, then you're no different than those things. You're no different than a coffee maker. A coffee maker exists to do one thing, make coffee. A coffee maker doesn't have other needs. You exist to do one thing. You exist to do one thing in their world, fulfill their needs. Beyond that, any other inconvenience you bring to the table is a real problem for them. It would be like the coffee maker saying, hey, can't we watch Netflix together? There's another personality pattern that has a far different flair than narcissistic personality called obsessive-compulsive personality. Now, this is very different than traditional obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is more of sort of an anxiety-based disorder characterized by rituals and obsessive thoughts. That's a very different issue. Obsessive-compulsive personality is characterized by interpersonal rigidity, an obsession with order, an obsession with rules, morality, regulations, self-righteousness, and in essence, really kind of also being a workaholic. These are folks who will reject people and human relationships in favor of getting things done and working all the time and getting things done the way they want them done, and they won't budge. There can be a fair amount of overlap between this obsessive compulsive personality style and narcissism. And especially in very controlling narcissists, you can see this rigid obsession with work and schedules and control overlapping with a lack of empathy, with entitlement and arrogance. It makes for a very uncomfortable, unpleasant form of narcissism when it's cut through with this rigid obsession with control and order. Now, for those of you who have been stuck in this type of a relationship, I would love to hear more what it's been like to be in one of these rigid relationships. Now, frankly, anyone who has ever gone through a divorce where the narcissist in your divorce was more obsessed with what is owed to them, what is due to them, what is fair and what is just to them. They are actually willing to give more money up to the attorneys just so you can have it. You folks get this very well. Listen, and as always, you're not going to be the one to end this cycle. Their terrifyingly organized cabinets, their rigid schedules, it may all seem very productive and nice and orderly. But when schedules and order are chosen above empathy, kindness, and other people, it just isn't healthy. And as a final note, another place where you can also see this kind of rigid obsessive order. It's not just the, I need to have my perfectly brewed tea at perfectly 10 a.m. no matter what. That kind of thing, you also see it around money. They'll be very, very, very rigid about anything related to money. And actually, an interesting trope of this kind of a character, if any of you ever saw The Devil Wears Prada, the boss in that story, you saw a lot of that rigid order. The book and the this and the meal and the coffee, and then this really cruel, almost rejection of anyone who's even trying to help and maintain these really disturbed schedules. The great kind of a cinematic trope for how that looks. If you've endured this, drop a comment, because I think when you have, you really know what this feels like, and it feels absolutely awful. And you do feel, no matter what, even if you put the tea on the table at the right time, the handle wasn't oriented the right way. As always with a narcissist, it's never enough. And since you are no different to them than the coffee maker in their life, be prepared that any demand you make is always going to be a problem for them, especially if it punctures their precious little schedules and order. So this relates to a consistent question I get from people all the time via the comments or emails or whatever is, does a narcissist know? Do narcissists know that they're narcissistic or difficult? And maybe even more important is the question of, do narcissists really know how insecure they are? Because clearly this person's insecure. Do they know? The answer to that is ish. Remember that shame, rage spiral I talk about so often? Narcissistic people aren't demented or frankly delusional. They are able to see that there are consequences to their behavior. And they know that their behavior at times is not a good look. But their impulsivity and their entitlement in some ways means that they cannot stop themselves and don't think they should have to. It's as though they will burst if they don't get their nonsense out. It's that tension reduction I talked about. So they know that over time, their behavior is kind of causing a problem, but they will rationalize their behavior, justify their behavior, explain it, defend it. But yeah, in a tiny corner of their brains, they know what they're doing is probably not a good thing. And sometimes in therapy, if they're in therapy, they may even admit that they can't stop themselves. It's too uncomfortable. They just need to get it out. And they know it sounds silly if they actually spoke their truth, which would be, why can't everyone just let me get away with what I have to say? I don't really mean it, and I just need to let it out. I think that everyone is out to get me when they don't let me, and life is so unfair to me, and I do always know what's best. Why can't everything just be my way and let me have my tantrum? They can't say that, and they know it, but that's what's happening. So there's an inflection point in every narcissistic relationship. It's the point when they see that you get it. It's a subtle dance. It's something that's happening just under the radar. It's almost imperceptible. You aren't taking the bait as much. You aren't letting the gaslighting get to you as much. You're gray rocking a little more. You're not defending. You're not explaining. You may even be holding yourself a tiny bit taller because now you get it. Maybe you aren't putting yourself down as much or getting as anxious when they say they will cut bait and leave, or maybe we need to get a divorce, or when they throw their passive aggressive stuff at you. Interestingly, at this phase of the relationship, it becomes even more miserable, and the narcissistic person will act out even more. It's as though you have peered into their insecurity and figured out their game, and they don't like that. When people start to gray rock, you can almost graph it. It looks like a roller coaster. The narcissist's rage will increase for a while. They aren't getting the same fights out of you. The bait isn't working. Remember, they need you to take the bait and behave in an unhinged way so then they can say, ooh, somebody's all worked up, and they can feel better about themselves. So they start getting meaner, up the roller coaster. They start insulting your friends or family. They start going after things about yourself that they know are triggers for you. They may make fun of your job. They may make fun of your cooking. It starts getting more and more toxic. You didn't think it was possible, but it is. But if you could stand your ground and not break, get to the top of that roller coaster, the narcissist will actually start to deflate. In some cases, they'll get bored, but they'll deflate. However, on your way to this destination, top of the roller coaster, is a world of abuse, anger, and rage. So if you thought it was bad before, zoop. So when you finally start to get it, somehow they sense it. For all of their lack of empathy, people with narcissistic personalities are tremendously attuned to their worlds, but from a to the world around them, but from a very egocentric perspective. They're always monitoring for threats. They're always looking for that person who looks at them the wrong way. They don't believe that they're ever showed the respect they believe they deserve. They feel like they don't get enough validation for all their greatness. They notice the shifts, and they notice that people are onto them. There is a point for every narcissistic person when they recognize that they have gone a bridge too far, that they really, really pushed a person to the breaking point, and that other person they push finally shuts down. This can actually be quite impactful if it happens, for example, at work or with a lower stakes person. The narcissistic people takes the people closest to them, like family and partners, for granted, so they may not notice it there. But the idea that someone out there in their world, like their work world or something, doesn't think well of them actually really activates their shame. Once they recognize that people are starting to see it and are starting to kind of walk around the narcissist as though the narcissist is unhinged, that in essence, they sort of feel like they're being kind of handled by other people, they don't like it because it activates shame. But now they're in a catch-22. Because at some level, they kind of know they're unhinged. So it's a big, strange circle. And at that point, you, if you're in a relationship with them, may slowly work your way to indifference. Once you have the roadmap for narcissism, and I'll be frank with you, that roadmap is the reason for me even starting this channel. I want to show you every subtle pattern there is so you can detect it. So you can consider Dr. Ramani's YouTube channel as like Narcissism GPS. Because then the pattern makes sense. You face the hard work of breaking your internal cycles of trauma bonding, etc. But once you see it, you start walking a much bigger circle around them, and they start to say like, oh, they see. They may have a wide range of behavior when you start walking that bigger circle and go between rage and trying to show you that they can keep it together and try to show you I'm actually a nice person. They may go to insults, to passive aggression. The narcissistic relationship is all about control. Controlling the image of the relationship to the world, controlling the people in the relationship, controlling the narrative, and controlling the narcissistic supply. Control, control, control. So once you understand what's happening, they want to control you even more. And they will not let you throw off their controlling ship because they want to control the narrative. And yet, once you understand it, their destabilization will mean that they can't get the control back. And now they're going to rage even more. There's no getting away from the rage. You may be thinking, is there a way for me to understand it without them losing it around me all the time? Probably not. You will either get bored of this relationship and leave, or if you can't leave, you just might make the relationship what we call very perfunctory and mechanical. Or you'll hope that they leave. Or you hope that they'll have a place to go to whenever they tantrum because you're not going to listen to it. At some point, your presence is going to be such a shame activator that they will either try to destroy you with their rage, or they may leave and run away because your presence is too shame-inducing for them. Neither of those outcomes are going to feel pretty good, especially if you're not sure you want this relationship to end. Yeah, I get it. You might think, oh, I shouldn't want it to end. You may not want it to end. You may also wonder, is there a way for you to understand this and for them to not understand that you understand it? Probably not, again. Your subtle behavioral shifts are going to be noticed. It's frustrating and demoralizing because they didn't notice you when you were crying, or didn't notice that you when you were actually trying to get them to notice you, but you make a tiny shift in narcissistic supply you give them and they notice it. Getting narcissism, understanding narcissism is tricky, and your partner will likely pathologize you for the change. They'll say things like, oh, you've changed, you're cold, you're weird. It seems like you're getting a little bit less socially skilled in your old age, on and on and on. They'll pathologize you for understanding them. So the very thing that will set you free, actually understanding the narcissism, can make your life miserable for a while. In the long term, it's a win. But in the short sprint, be aware that it will be unpleasant, so you can at least prepare. So if we just think about this, getting it, understanding narcissism. Once you get it, you might feel like, ha, I have the keys to the kingdom, I get this. But as your behavior shifts, the narcissistic person you're in a relationship is going to notice it, whether it's a family member, whether it's a partner, whether it's someone you work with. They're going to notice it in many, many cases. And that might mean that they're uncomfortable because what really was a power they held, and you know it was a power they held because you didn't understand what was going on. You were upside down with the gaslighting and the manipulation. Now you get it, you see it. There's actually a strange calm and serenity that will come over you because you get it, right? It's almost like, this is how you do the trick. And now it's not even interesting anymore. But they'll notice that shift and recognize they can no longer dominate, overpower you, confuse you. Then they've lost their power and they get frustrated. And that frustration is something you will experience as rage. Like I said, in the long term, it's healthier for you to get it for no other reason so that you stop blaming yourself and personalizing it. And that's your work to do, to not blame yourself, because it's not your fault. It's just that once you get it, you should have unlocked the code. And this rather quiet, manipulative way they kept you under their thumb, you've kind of lifted it in a way. It can feel very unsatisfying as a relationship at this point, but at least you're not living in a place where you're constantly invalidated, confused, and don't know which way is up. I hope that helps. Thanks again.